Started. Thanks again for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks again for coming. Today's talk might be a little controversial. We don't know. It's talking about the movement of neurodiversity affirming practices, which has a lot of nuances to it. We're still learning. This is definitely an intro to neurodiversity affirming practices. In no means is it going to be a comprehensive talk about it. There's a lot to say about this movement, but hopefully this will just kind of get the ball rolling for us as therapists in our community and help us to better communicate with the families that we work with.
Well, first, we just kind of wanted to start by just addressing some of the history surrounding like how we've all been taught to think about autism, talk about autism, and then start to introduce that shift in where we're going with talking about autism as a field. The first is that autism has historically been thought of as a neurological and developmental disorder. However, recently, within the past 5-ish years, there's been a shift in how the autism community really wants to be self-identifying and how they would like to be recognized by professionals, their family, their peers. And that shift primarily focuses on autism as a difference in neurotype or how a person's brain is wired. And that's really been fueled by evidence showing that autistic people have a different neurotype to those that do not have autism. Part of that is there's some evidence showing that there's differences in the synaptic pruning process that happens in autistic individuals, and that's just that brain's natural process of eliminating extra synapses to allow for more efficient brain functioning as we get older. And so since there is that difference, there's some evidence showing that that could be potentially contributing to why autistic brains work differently than neurotypical brains. We'll also go into some of that terminology in a bit here too. So yeah, that was interesting. I linked some studies here as well. And then the other thing that we're kind of starting to think about too is previously we really thought of autism, we've been talking about autism in terms of levels of functioning or severity levels. So for a long time, we've described someone who's autistic as maybe low functioning or having severe autism, but a lot of autistic adults are now really asking that we use instead support needs or levels of support needs. So really just shifting to focusing on how we can best support autistic individuals. So instead of saying things like low functioning, this person has high support needs, or instead of saying they have severe autism, they have higher support needs. When we would maybe have said higher functioning, now we're kind of going more towards that low support needs classification instead.
Oh, and then the last big thing that probably is the most obvious to all of us is that change in language. So I think back to when I was in graduate school in 2000, I think, I don't remember. So 20 plus years ago, we would kind of be taught to use person first language. So it would be child with autism or adult with autism. And honestly, besides that, there wasn't really a lot of talk about how to talk about those with autism. We really didn't have those conversations except for person first language. That's the biggest thing that I remember. And so that shift has come to identity first language. And so we're using autistic person or autistic child, or some people will self-identify, I am autistic. It can be uncomfortable for those that, like me, was so focused on person first because it means you're putting the person first. But there's a lot of really good descriptions out there about what identity first means, and that a lot of autistic people really feel like it's part of them. You can't take the autism out of them. I had one example at a conference once talk about, a wooden chair is not a chair that has wood. And I thought it was a really simplistic way to think about it, but it was helpful. If you take the wood out of the chair, it's not really a chair anymore. So it's part of their being, and so there's no reason to make it here's me and this extra part of me that, does it make a difference? It does. It's part of them. So, and nowadays it's talked about very differently. So, we were talking about graduate school for Hannah, she always has talked about identity first language. And then I asked Erin about it, and you were saying,
Yeah, basically, I'm currently in graduate school, and we talk a lot about identity first and just neurodiversity affirming practices in our multicultural classes and our professional issues classes, and just making sure to value that individual for their preferences and honor kind of how they want to be identified, because it is a big part of their identity and what they want in treatment and evaluation. So, yeah.
which I thought was really cool because it is showing us it's not just a phase. Things happen differently throughout history. And so just even knowing the history of autism, at the very beginning, it was labeled under schizophrenia in the DSM. So we have come a really long way. And so it's just helpful to know that this is progress, and progress sometimes feels uncomfortable. Progress sometimes can be wrong a little bit. And so the pendulum swings a little too far one way or the other, but we're always going to land on we're always going to do best practices. So, and listening to those in the community to teach us, not just us to teach them. So.
And something we'll kind of talk about all throughout this presentation too is that even though this is kind of how the terminology is shifting, it's really going to be up to the individual and their families as to how they want to identify. And we'll kind of talk about that as we get more into practices as well, but just kind of following their lead with things too. So just going over a little bit of terminology that we've already kind of started to use in this presentation and that we'll continue to use. The first is just neurodiversity, which refers to the natural diversity of human brains. Neurodivergent refers to a person whose brain functioning differs from what's been typically considered as normal. And there's a lot of different ways to be neurodivergent, which we'll kind of get into on our next slide. Neurotypical refers to a person whose brain functioning is what we would typically consider as normal. And then neurodiverse itself is just a group of people with different kinds of brains. Graphic that we felt really helped to represent a lot of the different ways that someone can be neurodivergent. Again, there's lots of different ways. This isn't even all of the different ones, but ADHD falls under that, generalized anxiety disorder, TBI. So lots of different ways to kind of consider someone neurodivergent. So when we're using that terminology, we're not just thinking about autism, even though it is part of that neurodivergent umbrella. And then also just acknowledging too that there can often be co-occurring diagnoses or even people being misdiagnosed for a variety of reasons. We'll also kind of address being late diagnosed with different conditions as well.
The umbrella, I feel like it probably is pretty similar to some of the speech therapists when we have the language umbrella and things, different categories and then what goes underneath it. Oh, the slide. So this is a really great way to kind of combine some of the information we just talked about. Oh, I don't have my notes on there. Okay, I'm winging it. I had some notes. That's okay. So these are two different graphics. They're kind of next to each other. So this one, it kind of stops here. So there's this graphic and then that graphic, just because it's so colorful, it's hard to see the difference. So the first, they're basically the same type of idea, just drawn different ways. And if you Google autism spectrum graphics, there's plenty of these wheels that come up. So basically, instead of it just being a linear thing, I'm less autistic to more autistic, or low functioning to high functioning, we really look at the individuals, and everybody has their own different spectrum, and it could be looked at in different ways. So this first one is a little bit more intricate, and it goes over all the different areas of maybe development or things that you experience in your life. So self-care, emotional regulation, proprioception, motor skills, language and communication, sensory, all of those different things, social relationships, physical differences. And you're able to, this one happens to have check marks of how much support a child or adult may need in those different areas. The one on the right is a little bit more basic. So that would be something maybe we could share with a family. And it just kind of goes over those simpler areas. So language, motor, sensory, perception, executive functioning. We can even find one with maybe social communication in there. And then the varying degrees of support for each of those areas, which leads into why nowadays when a child gets diagnosed with autism, they don't usually use that mild, moderate, severe anymore. It's those levels, and those levels are how much support a child needs in order to carry out daily routines and things, different developmental areas in their life. So it's a really nice beginning way to look at, neurodiversity and kind of introduce it to families that maybe have not been, exposed to this way of thinking about it.
I've never seen this chart before, so am I reading it correctly to say like you need more support, check mark goes out?
You know what? I'm not sure. I think so. I think it's more support as the check mark goes in.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Color would be like less
Yes.
support on
So
both sides.
the closer the check mark is into the wheel, the more support that child may need. But again, like we may not even feel like it's necessary to put a check mark. I feel like the one on the right, if we had different areas we could even make our own graphic in different areas. It's just a really nice way to like explain and explore the different support levels within one individual.
So I've been hearing lately like the autism 1, autism 2. Does that kind of go along with the levels of support as well?
What do you mean by autism 1?
I've just had families tell me like that their child was diagnosed with autism 1.
Oh, so yeah, so like they're getting, level 1 through 4. So Erin was actually on the KU autism evaluation team.
Yeah, we did it by levels. I think we only had 1 through 3, but that might be what they're thinking of.
Is
It
the
just
level.
it helps clarify to parents like in a more maybe like measurable way. But we always state like kids can also move through the levels as they develop. So yeah, I like this way of thinking about it, looking at
This
their
might
strengths.
actually be really helpful for parents when they are like, oh, my child's a level 2, and just understanding that that's like a fluid thing.
Yeah.
At the moment, this is how much support they need. And most likely the children that we are serving, because they're so young, just, by nature, they need more support. And so helping a parent kind of like understand what that means, and that it might change as they grow, and even the individual areas might change as they grow. So. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and the level 1, 2, 3 correlates to mild, like what we used to think of as mild, moderate, severe, is now 1, 2, 3.
And I have heard somebody from KU who does the evaluations there say that pretty much all of the kids that they will give a diagnosis to that are in our program, like under age 3, they're going to give like the highest need of support level just because they're young and yeah.
Any other questions?
So is that to say then, as they have the support and we're seeing progress, that number will move?
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
It won't always, but it definitely can.
So is 4 most severe or least severe?
I think
I think it
3.
just goes to
I think it goes
3.
up
It
to
just
3.
goes to
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and 3 more.
Needs the most
To
support.
most support needed.
And I believe in the evaluations, they're not really going into intricate detail of like, they need more support in this area versus this area. Because it's so individualistic and so fluid that it really they wouldn't be able to give an accurate diagnosis in that way.
Yeah.
So they're giving the parents a generalized way, because that's what parents want too, like it's really hard to not have some kind of information on like, I need you to clarify what this means. And so I think that's where we can come in after a diagnosis, is like really helping the parents understand like where that comes from, why they're using that, and what it means. So.
As I go to the next slide. We also just wanted to talk a little bit about what parents and caregivers might be seeing or hearing specifically as it relates to social media. I know we're all very well aware of the fact that a lot of parents are going to be hearing and seeing different things about all of the different areas that we support children with on social media. So the first thing that they might see if they're doing their own research or just kind of getting information on their like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all the different things, is just hearing perspectives from autistic individuals. I feel like that's a way that I've been able to learn a lot about neurodiversity affirming practices too, is just getting their perspective on their experiences growing up as an autistic child, kind of how they'd like to be identifying now, all of those things. They'll also be hearing about changes in representation. That's kind of been led by the autism community, thinking of like a lot of autistic adults are really pushing for using this rainbow infinity symbol instead of the puzzle piece to represent autism. The puzzle piece originated in the UK in 1963 and then was later adopted by Autism Speaks like in the early 2000s, kind of as the official symbol for autism. But many autistic adults are kind of acknowledging that the puzzle piece just has a problematic history. I believe the original puzzle piece showed a picture of a child crying in the middle of it, kind of talking about the sadness related to being someone who's afflicted with autism. So it just has kind of a troubling history, and then also just represents the historic views of autism as a puzzling condition. So instead, they'd really like to move towards using this rainbow infinity symbol just to represent that autism is really vast and complex and has a really wide range of strengths and challenges that come with it. And then the other thing that parents might be hearing as well on social media is just what kind of therapies are available to them. They might be hearing from different people within the autism community that they don't recommend ABA services. And our stance as an agency is really just to meet families where they're at and support them with whatever their choice is. So just letting them know what options are available, which Julie will suggest, or we'll be talking about later on too. But just really meeting them with where they're at and supporting them with whatever decision they decide to move forward with for their child. Questions?
Dig deeper. So this is my guy. On the right is when he was probably still part of Infant Toddler Services. And this was like about a year ago. He just had his 22nd birthday, and I appreciate Stacey asking me to share a little bit about my story. I love talking about Josh and how early intervention really was key and who he is today. We started receiving services when he was about 26 months old. At that time, he knew he was delayed in language and had some unusual behaviors that I'll show you in the next slide. But we weren't sure why, and we went to the 24-month-old visit, and our Dr. Winburn was our pediatrician. Probably many of you have worked with her. She recommended us reach out to ITS, and I'm forever grateful for that because it was key in helping him be who he is. Nikki Wiedauer and Amy Cook were his therapists, so pretty amazing. It's an amazing thing that I get to now be a part of helping other families in that journey. So if you'll go, so this is just, I'm not going to read through all this, but this just shows you all the things about him and his individual differences and the things that we worked through when he was little. Lots of sensory processing differences, didn't know how to play with toys, didn't have any interest in feeding himself or dressing himself. We had to break things down into individual steps with pictures for all those things. Very in his own little world, very connected with his parents, but not very interested in social interactions beyond the immediate family. So very sensitive, cried often, relied on me to be the co-regulator, and you guys might see that a lot too, where you might see like they're really connected with mom. That doesn't mean that they may not have autism. I mean, autistic people can be very social, but within certain parameters. So that's kind of, I think, a myth about autism is that they can't be social, but I'll talk more about who he is today, but we had to teach him how to advocate for his own needs, or the whole my turn or stop and all those things that you guys are now working on with kids too. So that's Josh then. But talking about the neurodiverse language, go ahead. Yeah. We decided as a family, now things were way different then, I do realize, that we were not going to label him and tell him he was going to therapy. We just said, we're going to go play with Miss Amy, or, those kinds of words, because I didn't want him to think that there was anything wrong with him. I just wanted him to be the best Josh that Josh could be. And I didn't want him to label or be limiting in what he was capable of, and I didn't also, when he got older and was in school, I didn't want the teachers to have him come in and already have just this thought of who he could be, and not see him as an individual, but as an autistic individual. So this is that varied stance, which today is a little bit different. We can say that, and people realize more now than then that there's a huge spectrum within autism. But that's where we were. And you might run into some families that, especially if they're autistic, the parent's autistic, they have lived a little bit of this. And so they might be a little hesitant to say, I'm an there's just such a varied view on that. If you'll hit the next slide. So that neurodiversity affirming therapy approaches, I'll touch a little bit about this because of the movement toward child-led and affirming the individual and the way that they process the world around them. Ideas and thoughts towards therapy are shifting a little bit, and I think our practice, our agency does an amazing job of being child-led. I mean, that's why I love what we do here. We promote that from the get-go of like following the child's lead and affirming who they are in their individual differences and using that to help them along in their therapy. But it's not that a neurodiversity affirming practices, we're not writing goals to normalize it at the expense of emotional and physical and psychological well-being. That's not the point of it. It's quite the contrast. It's just to affirm who they are as an individual. And there's some we'll talk a little bit on the next slide, but I did include a link about ABA and that controversy, if it can affirm neurodiversity. So if you want that link, I felt like it was a really great article that just is good to reflect on and just kind of hear that other point of view. So within our community, the ones that are highlighted in gray, I was able to find either therapists that have been trained in this or actual programs. A lot of our therapists are ESDM, which is an ABA-based, more behavior-based, but it does have that relationship-based. I love that part of it, that it's about building those positive and fun relationships. OASIS is through KU. It's a parent implemented model that's based on ABA principles, more than words. Of course, we have that, which is a great program. DR Floor Time, which there are a few practitioners in our area, KCDT being one of the therapy centers that has as well as play abilities. So if you have a family that are asking about DR Floor Time, those are the practices that I'm aware of, and you guys might know some too. And then I'm currently working on my second level of DR Floor Time. There's 4 levels. I'm working on the second level, which is pretty intense, but I love it. And then Play Project is based off of DR Floor Time principles, and they are out of KCDT as well. I don't know about these other 3 that are listed on some of the main websites for if these are in our community, PRT, and Amy might know, Wilcoxon. But those are some others that are mentioned on a lot of autism websites. So,
Wasn't there, you know what, I just realized in this moment, there was one other one that we were kind of doing a little bit.
Responsive teaching.
Responsive teaching was one, and we just
You
weren't sure if
mentioned
that was something, because that was from a while ago. But there was another one that I think maybe it was the PRT. It might have been. Anyway, I'll look into it and get back to you.
Yeah, we chose Floor Time because of the relationship base. That was key to us. That was why we chose that over the behavioral based approach, and that it is very individual. Like it looks at that sensory profile very much so, and uses that as the guide. Like that's the first step when you're working in DR floor time is to do that sensory profile and use that to guide your therapy.
And in no means are we like, oh, you should know all of these. It's more of just like knowing
This is
there's
here.
a lot of varied approaches. They all kind of have like some common core among them. And even now, I think some of them are still kind of developing a little progress towards more neurodiversity affirming
Yes.
ways
yes.
of doing that particular strategy.
I would agree.
And
So,
all of these are available to families in our area right now?
All the
In the
gray
gray.
and that's through Julie like researching it. So
Yeah.
again, it's not something we're like going to recommend to families.
right.
It's more like
These are-
this is our awareness of things so that when families come to us or ask us about things or say, hey, this is what I started, we're just aware of what's out there.
I do not feel like all of these things listed are part of the recommendations given to families once they do receive the diagnosis.
They aren't.
No.
And so how do we
that's-
help advocate for families, but also the law is only dictating what's being covered
Right.
insurance wise, right?
Which some
Correct.
states have made a shift, but ours has not.
And it is what is covered besides ABA up there based on the law in Kansas.
Play and DR floor time
Are
are
they?
covered in other states, but
But
not
in Kansas,
ours.
it's just ABA.
Just ABA to be covered fully as a way to have a child be part of a program.
To be a program. Yes.
However, if you go to KDDT or if you go somewhere, KCDT,
Yeah.
your insurance also covers therapy. So it just depends on
That could be
on
the
a family's
workaround, yeah.
insurance.
Yes.
Yeah, ABA is
If they
recognized
take
by
their-
insurance companies as the autism program. These other ones are recognized by some insurance companies as therapy. So it might be like through the speech therapist and it's just billed as speech therapy or just billed
Right.
as
As far as
occupational
billing.
therapy.
So that could be the workaround for families that have
Yes.
that resource.
Right.
Yeah.
And just thinking about like, all of these things are not something we want to list because it's very overwhelming. So
Yeah,
like helping
no.
parents through that after diagnosis part, we're not gonna give them every single piece of information unless they really want it. And that's probably why Children's Mercy and KU, those two main places that you get a diagnosis, they have different ways of giving information to parents, like their reports look different. That was one of the things we did in our meetings was just kind of like look at those reports and kind of see like what are families seeing when they get diagnoses from these different places.
I do believe if they go to like a private clinic, like children's therapy services, they're getting some extra recommendations for therapies to look into after getting that diagnosis. And then as far as like DIR floor time goes, I think KCDT trains all of their therapists in
Yes.
it. And then they also take Medicaid. I feel like I've talked to therapists there that do take Medicaid. So that could be an option if a parent's specifically looking for a therapist that's trained in that strategy outside of therapists at our own organization.
But that's something hopefully as time allows, I would love to push legislation to have more opportunities out there than just APA to be covered. So we'll see. It's a battle when you're talking about money and funding and all that. So, yeah, good questions though, very good questions. So honoring we've kind of talked about this already a little bit, but really it's about honoring a parent's point of view about therapy and using that strength-based language when we're having our discussions with the parents. Helping them as parents identify their strengths because a parent implemented model may not be good for them. It's just the reality. Some just nature of like the home or their work life. If they work a 60-hour work day, can they implement do a parent implemented model? So ABA might be the best option for them because otherwise they're not getting the 20 to 40 hours of recommended therapy intervention, which can be parent implemented in day-to-day routines. Research does back that. But not every parent is at that place where they can do that. And so that's when we help them identify the local programs, be open to their ideas. For ABA, then let's help them find that. But if they're leaning towards more the floor time, let's help them find that too. And I honestly don't know, other than Playabilities or KCDT, that has some other approaches. But maybe you guys know, and I'm happy to learn from you guys. So let me know if you come across with anything. We're happy to put that in our SharePoint. But we need to really make sure we're accepting parents that as equal partners, really listening to their voice in all of this, and be hopeful about it, that therapy approaches can help their child, but we also have to have honest conversations, knowing that if they don't receive services, I mean, I know I'm kind of like preaching toward the choir. We don't get the services they need, and it be pretty intensive in their early years. It's just going to make it harder for them to socially, communicate and things like that later on. So there are, of course, the opponents to this movement, and I think the voice, I think it's something to put out there just to kind of be thinking about. A lot of family members that have high support needs, believe that it is a disorder that needs treatment, because that's part of the whole neurodiversity affirming movement. It's not to say that they need treatment, but some say, yes, we need treatment because it is hard for these individuals, and they hold that it minimizes their struggles, and it kind of trivializes the diagnosis. And then leaders of the within certain more medical worlds, even especially, fear that it could take funding away toward causes and treatments and that research that goes into how we can provide the best optimal treatment, or not treatment. See that? I still even say that. It's hard not to say treatment, because that's like the neurodivergent affirming practice does not even say treatment. Like that you are working with them to have the most. I always have thought it's helping Josh to be the best version of himself that he can potentially be. However you want to word that with your families, let that flow however it's natural to you, but we have to honor them, get away from the treatment, this is a therapy treatment. Okay, so I think that's all of what I was saying on that.
So as we kind of think about those critiques of maybe that neurodiversity affirming approach, also just recognizing that it is very much a strengths-based approach. I feel like our agency does a really great job of incorporating strengths-based approaches to our services. And so we just wanted to address what it is and what it is not, because I feel like there can sometimes be some misconceptions around that. So it is valuing everyone's individual differences and focusing on what a child can do. We're still going to be acknowledging what is challenging for them, but just kind of focusing on that in different ways. Acknowledging that all people experience difficulties and challenges that do need attention and support. Others might need more support than some do. So that's kind of where we think about those levels of support needs as well that we introduced earlier in the presentation. And then these next two I found from Learn, Play, Thrive, which I just really loved how they kind of talked about that strengths-based approach. The first is that it's an approach that is striking a balance between accepting that neurodivergent people think differently and also finding a way to teach them new skills in a way that works for them. And then it's also an approach to therapy that allows parents, their children, and clinicians to find joy together as we help them learn new skills in a way that's effective, engaging, and respectful.
Yeah, so in kind of the opposite way is, what is this approach not? And so a lot of times for me, when I first started understanding this a little bit more, the whole right side are all the things that I was thinking. And so we want to make sure that there's a lot of people talking about a lot of parts of this. And so just because there's someone talking about it doesn't mean necessarily A, that they know everything about it, or B, that some of that is just their perception of it. So really we want to make sure we're not putting our rose-colored glasses on, and I think that's the thing that helps us realize that this neurodiversity affirming movement is helpful and supportive of those who may be neurodiverse. So we're not only talking about positive things. We are going to talk about hard things. We are going to talk about their differences and how it makes it hard for them to go through their routines, or as adults, be able to function the way that they want to in a society. We're not talking about minimizing concerns or avoiding difficult conversations. So we're not gonna be like, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. Like, that's not what a parent wants to hear. And we're not gonna minimize a parent's concerns either. And striking that balance between accepting that a neurodivergent person think differently, because we can't change that. That is not something that is going to neurologically change. It is just part of their neurodifference. And so also finding a way to help them learn new skills and works for them in a way that it was neurodiverse. And so we're not fixated only on the problems or the deficits, but we're going to use their strengths to help support the things that they need support with. And then also it is an approach to therapy that allows everyone to work together and find joy together. It's not an assumption that an individual doesn't understand or can't do certain things. So we talk a lot about that phrase, presumed competence. And so we do that already with the parents that we work with. We don't go into a home saying this parent knows nothing and we're the ones that are going to teach them. We're presuming the parent's competence not only with their own child, but with their ability to understand development and know what to do for their child that would help certain things that they want to work on. So we're always presuming competence, or hopefully always presuming competence with our families, and we want to do the same thing with autistic individuals. So an example that you wrote down here was, how we kind of allow them to try different approaches and support them individually. So an example would be when we're working on communication, we're not going to presume that the child, because they're non-speaking, will never be able to communicate in any sort of verbal way or any sort of alternative way. So we're going to try different things. We're going to try sign language, we're going to try pictures, we're going to try AAC, and we're going to presume that they are able to communicate with us, but it might just look different. So that's kind of what we already do. And it's just nice to know that this isn't something different. We're not asking you to think drastically different. We're asking just more understanding on both sides. So. Where are we?
It's my turn. So I'll be honest with you, this shift in language is hard for me. It just really is. I am still tempted to call my son high-functioning autistic. That's just what I've said for so long. And so I'm really trying to make the shift, and we can just all try to grow together in that, the ones that have been around in the therapy world for a long time. But I just, in today's world, functioning is, can seem cold and clinical is the viewpoint, and that it can undermine a child's or an individual's self-confidence. So that's part of the reason for the shift of not saying functioning. And then, so now I am trying to say, when people ask that, even parents, that I try to frame them as someone who requires minimal support. So that's the shift in terminology that we're trying to start to say, or describe him just as an individual, that he's worked through these things, this is who he is today. Just talking about him as a person, we wouldn't put even necessarily say that he's autistic. And that I'm going to share a quote later from him that will tell you why I say what I say, because I want to him. So it's very, once again, individualized in how we talk about people based on what they want it to kind of look like. I do want to share a perspective from a mom that just happened. Is Jana in here? She was with me. I don't think Jana is here today. So we were having a joint visit with a mom, and she has two boys. The oldest is 4 and at Blue Valley's program. And when she was talking to the teacher there, she told her that her younger son had autism as well. And the teacher said, "I'm sorry." And that really offended mom. When she asked me, knowing that I have a son with autism, she said how I would respond to that, and that she didn't know what to say, because it's in her thought was, well, it's not like he has cancer, he's not dying. So we have to, my thought was, I bet the teacher was just trying to be compassionate with her and know that because they know that's hard, but I don't think they meant like there's something wrong with your child, but it can be perceived that way. So that's why I bring up that story, because it just happened this week, and I just felt like, oh my goodness, we have to be like, even though we're so empathetic as practitioners, and all of us seem to be, and we just have to be careful in how we respond, and not to say like it's something wrong with their child. So yeah, and then you wanted to share a little bit too.
Two things. So non-speaking, and I think again, Hannah put these notes in here, but thank you. So non-speaking versus nonverbal kind of sounds the same. Like I even have trouble being like, what's the difference? But basically it just is highlighting the alternative communication methods that might be used with individuals who are neurodivergent. So other than spoken language. So a lot of people in the autism community see it as more of an inclusive term, and it can kind of cover those who can communicate through a variety of forms, AAC, ASL, writing, typing, but can also make vocalizations. And so I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was someone who was talking about sometimes she needs her AAC device. There are such thing as part-time AAC users. And so I think it just kind of helps open up our ideas of like talks, doesn't talk, verbal, nonverbal, like what that means. And really quick, I just thought of this idea. I have a little kid, and so I'm going to think about him in my head. I'm going to describe him in both ways, and just to kind of give you guys an idea of like who it's really hard, but then again, it's super easy, and we're not describing a children differently about like who they are. It's just the way that we're talking about them. And so I have a kid who is obsessed with spinning things. He's really rigid. He doesn't like to change routine. He'll have severe meltdowns when mom wants him to eat. He's pretty low functioning. He has some social deficits, doesn't really interact with anybody besides his parents. He's nonverbal, so he doesn't have any words. And the red flags we're seeing are blah, 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 blah. Now I can talk about that same child. This child is really passionate about spinning things and building things to watch it knock down. He has a really deep interest in going under his tent and waiting for his parents to come join him and put on a flashlight. He has a preference for consistency. It's a lot easier on his day when things kind of go similarly for his eating routine. He feels really emotionally intense when he is done eating and mom's kind of wanting him to sit further in the high chair. So he lets mom know that by getting upset and having intense emotions. He socializes differently. So when we come over, his favorite way to socialize with me is to kind of go face to face and smile. And he really enjoys socializing through music. So Wheels on the Bus and Itsy Bitsy Spider are like amazing tools that we use to help him socialize with everyone in the room, and maybe in the community. Mom's going to start bringing him to some library play groups and music play groups. He's also non-speaking, so right now a lot of his communication is through a little bit of sign language, and we're working on if we can figure out what is more helpful to him, visual supports versus maybe like an AAC device, and we're just kind of exploring things right now. So I talked about the same child, and you probably pictured him in your head really similarly, the both ways that I talked. But the first one was just negative and sad and gives me the chills, like that just makes me feel bad. And it makes people say, I'm sorry to that parent. I don't know, I'm getting upset right now. Just emotional. I really love this child. So, and it may be, Erin could even think about who I was talking about just because she's with me, so. Anyway, that's just like a really easy way to like think about it, because it's not that different, but it's just about perspective sometimes.
And I think these are just examples of different ways to communicate that. It's going to look different. We're all probably going to say things differently and maybe use what is now considered the outdated terminology, and that's okay. But just kind of thinking about how can we start to reframe that as we talk about autistic people. And then also just thinking too about like with those, the wording that we used to use, it's just very subjective as well. Like it's very negative, but it's also subjective and based on like how we're perceiving this other person based on our own lived experience. So just kind of trying to use a more objective way of explaining them too.
So how can we promote some neurodiversity affirming practices at ITSJC? First, be yourselves and be the therapists you already are. If you're interested in maybe feeling like, okay, I kind of want to work on this for myself a little bit, there's lots of ways you can increase personal neurodiversity awareness. So there's a link to something there. And then the other ways we can be mindful of it when we're working with caretakers. Oh, so that's one thing we talked about just a little bit earlier, is that as we go through our professional lives, we are recognizing more that genetic component and that there are more adults being diagnosed late. And so we're going to be working with parents who are neurodiverse. We're going to be working with parents that are undiagnosed and maybe aware and refer to themselves as autistic or not. So just knowing, like, it's not, as we know in our field, you know, we're working with the parents, we are going to be working with neurodiverse adults. So just being more mindful of that. You know, I think we've done a good job. We're not doing the, oh, this parent's really weird. Like, we're not using that terminology anymore. And we're just kind of trying to build on a parent's strengths also. There's a lot of people who identify with this movement and see themselves as neurodiverse, even if they're not officially diagnosed. So again, there is that perception of like, oh, everybody thinks they're autistic. But maybe that's just a really great way of us all connecting with each other in society. You know, like my daughter came to me and she's like, oh, I feel like I'm autistic a little bit. And I'm just like, at first I poo-pooed her. I'm like, no. And then the more we talk about things and look at the traits and how she learns and how she thrives, there are some neurodiversity traits that I see in her. So it's really nice to like recognize it without poo-pooing it, without feeling like there has to be a diagnosis or it has to be labeled. Also, the other thing, incorporating into our language, don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's like we say things because we care. And so we're never going to say something wrong. And if we say something really wrong, we apologize for it. So, you know, if we're afraid to make mistakes, then we're going to avoid the opportunities to learn for ourselves or for families to learn better about their children or learn better about themselves. So we talked about asking open-ended questions because we really don't want to assume anything of how a family thinks. And so asking like, what do you know about neurodiversity? When their child gets a diagnosis, you know, we're not going to say, oh, I'm so sorry. We're going to say, well, how do you feel about that? And then honor their feelings on it. And then the other thing we talked about is that our community of practice. So I don't think I officially changed it in any capacity in our wording in our folder, but we were doing a autism support group that has come a long way, but recently in the past year or two, we've been working more on neurodiversity affirming practices. And so we're changing the name to NDAP, Community of Practice. So if you're interested, we meet quarterly. I feel like we're just at the piece where we're going to move forward with some different ways to do this group. The past year, we've been kind of like doing different things like looking at evaluations or talking about this part of it or talking about school transitions. And I feel like our next steps, like right now, we're going to all listen to a podcast and then come back together at our next meeting in November and kind of talk about it. No, I did not send that email out yet. I'm Nadine. And so, but I've got two really good ones and I'm like, yay. One of them is going to be a podcast, Two Sides of the Spectrum, Winnie Dunn and sensory processing differences and stuff. And it was really interesting to listen to. And so, yeah, if you're interested, come to that and we can discuss and stuff like that. We also added to it just last time with Laura. We were like, this would be a really great way to have kind of a little primary coaching. So come to the meeting with like, how do I do this? Or what should I do? So, yeah.
The other thing that we can do is just take cues from the community itself. So listening to autistic voices, whether that's the autistic adults that we're supporting within the services that we provide. These are just a couple different, there's an autistic SLP linked and then an autistic psychology professional. He has a really great CEU about the autistic neurotype. And then we'll have some more stuff linked in the resources. And then also just kind of thinking of it similar to how we take cues about deaf culture. So the deaf community has kind of created this whole culture around their disability. And I linked an article in this that was really interesting from the perspective of a deaf autistic person. And kind of just talking about the similarities between the two communities and just taking cues from those communities, basically.
So speaking of autistic voices, I did interview my son just to get his perspective and to allow him to have a voice in this, since I was putting him on the screen. He knows. This is what he wanted to share with you all, knowing who was going to be listening. Knowing that I am autistic helps me understand why I process sensory information different than others. I think it's cool that I can hear sounds that others don't hear and that my brain has perfect pitch. So in that way, I like that I have autism. But in the negative sense, people with autism, such as myself, must deal with things that come natural to people without autism, such as fine motor skills, whether it be bringing food on the fork to my mouth, because we've talked about that used to be hard for him, or putting a button through the loop. We worked hard on buttons. When I went through that, it was very frustrating on the inside. I constantly asked myself these questions. Why is this so hard for me to do? Why did I have to be the one to deal with these things? How can I overcome these trials that I face? And then he went on to say, I don't really think of myself as an autistic person as much as someone who was diagnosed with autism. I've grown to accept the label, but it doesn't define me. Based on the help that I got at a young age, it helped me become who I am today. I feel like if I hadn't had therapy, that I wouldn't be as independent as I am, and that I would still need therapy. I thought that was interesting. With all the therapies and support from others, I can proudly say, this is his words, I'm a high-functioning person with autism. So there's going to be different voices out there, and we just have to hear them, accept that, that's their story, but be mindful of the language that we use, that it is affirming of them as an individual in their journey of life. We're all on a different path. We all have different ways that we experience the world around us from a sensory perspective, especially. So, that's what he wanted you guys to know. Love it.
And then we also just wanted to include some resources if you're interested in learning more about neurodiversity affirming practices. So we linked some CEUs. I did the Learn, Play, Thrive Continuing Education Summit last year and really loved it. It had a great mix of professionals who work with the autistic population, but then also autistic people themselves presenting on different topics. There's also some podcasts linked here, and then also just sharing some different social media accounts from people who are artistic themselves, work in our fields, stuff like that, and then just some different books. So, it's been a lot of information. What questions does anyone have, if any?
Or comments,
Comments, yeah.
Just thoughts, things like that.
Things that we could learn from you about, maybe.
I do have to say, when I think Stacy and I can't remember who else came with us, we went to CASHA 2 years ago, and Carrie Ebert presented, and we went to a couple of other presentations on neurodiversity, and it was really the first time that the information was presented to me versus just watching TikToks over the pandemic and listening. And I was so excited, and I couldn't wait to spout the information and stuff like that. And I recognize now that obviously, it's not for us to talk for autistic individuals, but also how much I needed to process the information and how much more it's neurodiversity affirming is more about listening and reflecting and affirming and doing all those things and not teaching. So we're not teaching neurodiversity affirming. We're using it and accepting it in our practice. And so I wouldn't go to Josh and be like, let me tell you what high functioning is. Like, like no,
And it's probably a reflection of me saying it that way for so long.
Yeah,
So
and it's not a bad thing. Nothing you say is like bad or a mistake or anything like that. It's more just this concept of how we can better our practices with our families. So
I have a question on the therapies that were local. Like I know ABA can be very time consuming and take up a lot of time. Are the non-ABA ones more like you go for an hour or what does it look
probably
like?
more, that's a great question. So most of those underneath there are parent implemented models.
Okay, so the parent learns
So,
and then works with the child.
I have
Okay.
I have a kiddo that I work with right now, and her mom is she's autistic, and she's very anti-ABA, and she has her daughter go to KCDT, and they do like 4 hours of therapy there, and mom watches and learns while watching, and they kind of coach her through that, what that would look like potentially at home. So that's how that floor time and play is very much like floor time. It's pretty much like a spin off of floor time, and their play therapists there as well, play project therapists. As far as Oasis, I'm not sure. That's just a KU program, like you'd go online and you'd sign up kind of thing. Of course, More Than Words we offer within our program. And yeah, as far as actually like take your child for therapy and drop them off, ABA is like the only thing that I am aware of. Now, I will tell you, all over the world, there are DRR floor time schools. Those exist. So there are other ways that people are doing therapy for children with autism. We just do not have that here yet. And
The other one that you were thinking about, Nadine, is
pathways. I just looked it up. I'm
Me
like,
too.
what? I never had a P in there.
Yeah, no, thanks for.
I was just with Erica and I'm like, she's gonna kill me if I can't.
Thank you. It's definitely not comprehensive.
Yeah. I mean, we could do like 4 lunch and learns on like all the different. I don't know who would present for all of them because it's not like any of us are like particular experts. Maybe just some of us or something. So, and I have a mom who like that was the way she wanted to go was ABA. She was a single full-time working mom. So that was one of the factors.
Mm-hmm.
She really had a hard time, getting a lot of confidence in herself. That's some of the thing we worked on during our sessions was a lot of confidence for herself to know what she could do. And so she toured like 5 or 6 ABA places and then landed on one, and like that was her process and that felt good to her and she's happy. And
I would encourage that too, like have them go and interview, because some are more play-based and more individualized than others. So really kind of help them, guide them through that process to what questions to ask.
Yeah, because there's a lot of ABA places. We've talked about how we like toured some of them. So.
Yeah, and maybe we should put some questions on our website. I just thought of that, like some more pointed questions to give the parents to ask.
Some of that.
Do you have like about how ABA?
How
they
open are
approach-
these places though to
Yeah, if you need to go.
tours? Yeah, sorry.
We know.
Because I feel like because of confidentiality, there's been a lot of like, Kelly, I don't know if that was it. We had a conversation with the mom earlier this week, and she said every place but one said you can't come to her.
Yep.
But here you can.
It just depends on the setting.
Yeah, it really depends on them. We had, so Kelly and Amy were like looking into places for us to tour. So we all toured autism from the start. And I think a couple of us, we talked about it in our last NDAP meeting. I don't know why I think NDAP is funny. Actually, my husband thinks we should call it NAP because neurodiversity is actually one word. And he's like, you just be like it's nap time. But we talked about that in our last one. There was a couple of us that toured another one.
There's this one specifically that said we are completely open to you coming in.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it was
let's
off
do that.
it's the 63rd and
The other thing is,
Blackburn.
for parents, when they want to tour, There were some, and I know some parents get confused about this because when you're going through the ABA process, as soon as you get started with that process where that facility is going to look into your insurance, you are kind of stopped at the other places. So in my conversation with the mom, I kind of explained to her, don't start any processes, don't sign up to get an evaluation, see who you can tour, and then once you kind of land our one or two, we can talk about it or whatever, but then move forward with, yes, I'd like to be put on the waiting list, yes, I'd like to make a schedule, or I'd like to schedule the evaluation.
But that
So-
can only be with one place, you're saying?
What's that?
That can only be with one place.
At a time for insurance purposes. So the ABA place, what's that?
Because they're running it through insurance.
Yes, there's Amy. Yeah, because they're running it through insurance and insurance will deny more than one at a time.
Right.
So that's what one of my moms, and I reached out to Amy, I'm like, what's going on? So she had to explain it to
So
me.
even for a waiting list,
I don't know, I guess it just depends on the place. Yeah,
Can they be on a wait list?
you have to be evaluated, right?
No.
No,
They can be on a wait list
they can be on a wait list
and they won't start that
process.
insurance until you're up at the top of the wait.
That's it, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so she had like toured one or two places that must have had openings and she must have signed up to do, schedule the evaluation. And then she got an email from one place that was like, you need to cancel this other one in order for us to move forward. So I said, cancel the evaluation because she didn't really like the place that much anyway. And I said, go ahead and tour places, ask, can I just have a tour? So,
I would say the ABA play, what is the name of it, that we just,
Autism from the Start.
yeah, that one was impressively individual, like really honored more so, I felt, the individual than other ABA programs that I have researched in the past, so that made me feel
Yeah.
better.
And that's kind of the point of like, I think us trying to tour is just to kind of have more information, but not really to like lead a parent into making a decision one
No,
way or
but
the
just to
other.
give them information.
Yeah. I don't know. If you're interested if you don't already come to our meetings and you want to, just email me and I'll add you to our distribution list. For our next one, which is November something. It's beginning of November, so.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
I was just gonna say, I don't know, I came from Wednesday, so maybe this is talked about, but I know there's a lot of us therapists who kind of wear place marks. I know it's been multiple times. Did we talk about this?
No, I didn't.
But there's a lot of us who will wear shirts. Maybe you've seen like the all play is play or future is
I'm wearing one
inclusive,
right
celebrate
now.
differences. It comes from that place marks, and I feel like that's just another way. I wear them to IEP meetings, eligibility. Like I just feel like that's another way just to kind of have that open way to parents to see.
Oh, no, I love knowing that. I didn't even know that, so.
We all want more t-shirts.
And she's the mom, she's a speech therapist, her son has a rare diagnosis of muscular dystrophy,
Yeah.
so
Oh, wow.
it's great.
Awesome.
Yeah, they post a lot of great information on their social media. Would recommend following
PlaySpark.
Yes. And they have like nice free handouts about stuff on their website. So that's kind of nice as well. Awesome. All right. Any other questions?
Thanks, everybody.